It is not that it is this or that trait that makes a unique personality of man, but that he is this and that trait. The enigmatic unity of the soul cannot be grasped by the cognitive process directly, but only when it is broken down into a multitude of strands, the resynthesis of which signifies the unique personality. Such a personality is almost completely destroyed under the conditions of a money economy. The delivery man, the moneylender, the worker, upon whom we are dependent, do not operate as personalities because they enter into a relationship only by virtue of a single activity such as the delivery of goods, the lending of money, and because their other qualities, which alone would give them a personality, are missing. This, of course, only signifies the ultimate stage of an ongoing development which, in many ways, is not yet completed, for the dependency of human beings upon each other has not yet become wholly objectified, and personal elements have not yet been completely excluded. The general tendency, however, undoubtedly moves in the direction of making the individual more and more dependent upon the achievements of people, but less and less dependent upon the personalities that lie behind them. Both phenomena have the same root and form the opposing sides of one and the same process. The modern division of labor permits the number of dependencies to increase just as it causes personalities to disappear behind their functions, because only one side of them operates, at the expense of all those others whose composition would make up a personality. The form of social life that would evolve were this tendency to be completely realized would exhibit a profound affinity to socialism, at least to an extreme state socialism. For socialism is concerned primarily with transforming to an extreme degree every action of social importance into an objective function, just as today the official takes up a position that is objectively preformed and that only absorbs quite specific individual aspects or energies of his personality, so a fully fledged state socialism would erect, above the world of personalities, a world of objective forms of social action which would restrict and limit the impulses of individual personalities to very precisely and objectively determined expressions. The relationship of this world to the former is similar to that of the relationship of geometric figures to empirical bodies. The subjective tendencies and the whole of the personality could then turn into activity by restricting themselves to one-sided functional modes into which the necessary societal action is subdivided, fixed and objectivated. The qualification of acts of the personality would thereby be completely transferred from the personality, as the terminus a quo, to objective expediency, the terminus ad quem. Thus, the forms of human activity would stand far above the full psychological reality of man, like the realm of Platonic ideas above the real world. Traces of such formations do frequently exist. Often a function in the division of labor confronts its holders as an independent imaginary formation so that they, no longer individually differentiated, simply pass through this function without being able or allowed to put their whole personality into these rigidly circumscribed individual demands. The personality as a mere holder of a function or position is just as irrelevant as that of a guest in a hotel room. In such a social formation, taken to its logical conclusion, the individual would be infinitely dependent. The one-sided determination of his performance would make him dependent upon supplementation by the action of all others, and the satisfaction of needs would result not so much from the specific abilities of the individual but rather from an organization of work which confronted him externally and which was conceived in accordance with a completely objective standpoint. If state socialism were ever to develop to its fullest extent, then it would pave the way for this differentiation of life forms. Money is responsible for impersonal relations between people. The money economy, however, exhibits such differentiation in the sphere of private interests. On the one hand, money makes possible the plurality of economic dependencies through its infinite flexibility and divisibility, while on the other it is conducive to the removal of the personal element from human relationships through its indifferent and objective nature. Compared with modern man, the member of a traditional or primitive economy is dependent only upon a minimum of other persons. Not only is the extent of our needs considerably wider, but even the elementary necessities that we have in common with all other human beings, food, clothing, and shelter, can be satisfied only with the help of a much more complex organization and many more hands. Not only does specialization of our activities itself require an infinitely extended range of other producers with whom we exchange products, but direct action itself is dependent upon a growing amount of preparatory work, additional help, and semi-finished products. However, the relatively narrow circle of people upon whom man was dependent in an undeveloped or underdeveloped money economy was established much more on a personal basis. It was these specific, familiar, and at the same time irreplaceable people with whom the ancient German peasant or the Indian tribesman, the member of a Slav or Indian caste, and even medieval man frequently stood in economic relations of dependency. The fewer the number of interdependent functions, the more permanent and significant were their representatives. In contrast, consider how many delivery men alone we are dependent upon in a money economy. But they are incomparably less dependent upon the specific individual and can change him easily and frequently at any time. We have only to compare living conditions in a small town with those in a city to obtain an unmistakable though small-scale illustration of this development. While at an earlier stage man paid for the smaller number of his dependencies with the narrowness of personal relations, often with their personal irreplaceability, we are compensated for the great quantity of our dependencies by the indifference towards the respective persons and by our liberty to change them at will. And even though we are much more dependent on the whole of society through the complexity of our needs on the one hand, and the specialization of our abilities on the other, than our primitive people who could make their way through life with their very narrow isolated group, we are remarkably independent of every specific member of this society, because his significance for us has been transferred to the one-sided objectivity of his contribution, which can be just as easily produced by any number of other people with different personalities with whom we are connected only by an interest that can be completely expressed in money terms. This is the most favorable situation for bringing about inner independence, the feeling of individual self-sufficiency. The mere isolation from others does not yet imply such a positive attitude. Stated in purely logical terms, independence is something other than mere non-dependence, just as, say, immortality is something other than non-mortality. Stone and metal are not mortal, but it would not be proper to call them immortal. Even the other meaning of isolation, loneliness, reflects the erroneous impression of pure negativity. If loneliness has a psychological reality and significance, then it in no way refers merely to the absence of society, but rather to its ideal and then its subsequently negated existence. Loneliness is a distant effect of society, the positive determination of the individual through negative socialization. If mere isolation does not produce a longing for others or satisfaction at being remote from others, in brief, a dependency of feeling, then man is placed completely beyond the question of dependency or freedom, and actual freedom takes on no conscious value because it lacks its opposite, friction, temptation, proximity to differences. If freedom means the development of individuality, the conviction to unfold the core of our being with all its individual desires and feelings, then this category implies not a mere absence of relationships but rather a very specific relation to others. These others have to be there and to be experienced as there in order to become irrelevant. Individual freedom is not a pure inner condition of an isolated subject, but rather a phenomenon of correlation which loses its meaning when its opposite is absent. If every human relationship consists of elements of closeness and distance, then independence signifies that distance has reached a maximum, but the elements of attraction can just as little disappear altogether as can the concept of left exist without that of right. The only question is then one of what is the most favorable concrete formation of both elements for promoting independence, both as an objective fact and as a subjective awareness. Such a situation seems to exist when, although extensive relations to other people exist, all genuinely individual elements have been removed from them, as in the case of mutual influences which are, however, exerted anonymously or regulations established without regard for those to whom they apply. The cause as well as the effect of such objective dependencies, where the subject as such remains free, rests upon the interchangeability of persons. The change of human subjects, voluntarily or affected by the structure of the relationship, discloses that indifference to subjective elements of dependence that characterizes the experience of freedom. I recall the experience referred to at the beginning of this chapter, namely that a change in obligations is often experienced as freedom. It is the same